The Princess Bride by William Goldman. Chapter 1. The Bride. The year that Buttercup was born, the most beautiful woman in the world was a French scullery maid named Annette. Annette worked in Paris for the Duke and Duchess de Guiche, and it did not escape the Duke's notice that someone extraordinary was polishing the pewter. The Duke's notice did not escape the notice of the Duchess either, who was not very beautiful and not very rich, but plenty smart. The Duchess set about studying Annette, and shortly found her adversary's tragic flaw: chocolate. Armed now, the Duchess set to work. The Palace de Guiche turned into Candy Castle. Everywhere you looked, bonbons. There were piles of chocolate-covered mints in the drawing rooms, baskets of chocolate-covered nuggets in the parlors. Annette never had a chance. Inside a season, she went from delicate to whopping, and the Duke never glanced in a direction without sad bewilderment clouding his eyes. Annette, it might be noted, seemed only cheerier throughout her enlargement. She eventually married the pastry chef, and they both ate a lot until old age claimed them. Things, it might also be noted, did not fare so cheerily for the Duchess. The Duke, for reasons passing understanding, next became smitten with his very own mother-in-law, which caused the Duchess ulcers, only they didn't have ulcers yet. More precisely, ulcers existed, people had them, but they weren't called ulcers. The medical profession at that time called them stomach pains, and felt the best cure was coffee, dolloped with brandy twice a day, until the pain subsided. The Duchess took her mixture faithfully, watching through the years as her husband and her mother blew kisses at each other behind her back. Not surprisingly, the Duchess' grumpiness became legendary, as Voltaire has so ably chronicled. Except this was before Voltaire. Now, the year Buttercup turned 10, the most beautiful woman lived in Bengal, the daughter of a successful tea merchant. This girl's name was Alithra, and her skin was of a dusky perfection unseen in India for 80 years. There have only been 11 perfect complexions in all of India since accurate accounting began. Alithra was 19 the year the pox plague hit Bengal. The girl survived, even if her skin did not. When Buttercup was 15, Adele Terrell of Sussex on the Thames was easily the most beautiful creature. Adela was 20, and so far did she outdistance the world that it seemed certain she would be the most beautiful for many, many years. But then one day, one of her suitors, she had 104 of them, exclaimed that without question, Adela must be the most ideal item yet spawned. Adela, flattered, began to ponder on the truth of the statement. That night, alone in her room, she examined herself pore by pore in her mirror. This was after mirrors. It took her until close to dawn to finish her inspection, but by that time it was clear to her that the young man had been quite correct in his assessment. She was, through no real fault of her own, perfect. As she strolled through the family rose gardens watching the sunrise, she felt happier than she had ever been. Not only am I perfect, she said to herself, I am probably the first perfect person in the whole long history of the universe. Not a part of me could stand improving. How lucky I am to be perfect and rich and sought after and sensitive and young and... young! The mist was rising round her as Adela began to think. Well, of course I'll always be sensitive, she thought, and I'll always be rich, but I don't quite see how I'm going to manage to always be young. And when I'm not young, how am I going to stay perfect? And if I'm not perfect, well, what else is there? What indeed? Adela furrowed her brow in desperate thought. It was the first time in her life her brow had ever had to furrow, and Adela gasped when she realized what she had done. Horrified that she had somehow damaged it, perhaps permanently, she rushed back to her mirror and spent the morning. And although she managed to convince herself that she was still quite as perfect as ever, there was no question that she was not quite as happy as she had been. She had begun to fret. The first worry lines appeared within a fortnight. the first wrinkles within a month, and before the year was out, creases abounded. She married soon thereafter the self-same man who accused her of sublimity and gave him merry health for many years. Buttercup, of course, at 15, knew none of this, and if she had, would have found it totally unfathomable. How could someone care if she were the most beautiful woman in the world or not? What difference could it have made if you were only the third most beautiful, or the sixth? Buttercup at this time was nowhere near that high, being barely in the top 20, and that primarily on potential, certainly not on particular care she took of herself. She hated to wash her face. She loathed the area behind her ears. She was sick of combing her hair and did so as little as possible. What she liked to do, preferred above all else really, was to ride her horse and taunt the farm boy. The horse name was Horse. Buttercup was never long on imagination, and it came when she called it, went where she steered it, did what she told it. The farm boy did what she told him too. Actually, he was more a young man now, but he had been a farm boy when orphaned. He had come to work for her father, and Buttercup referred to him that way still. "Farm boy, fetch me this. Get me that, farm boy. Quickly, lazy thing, trot now, or I'll tell father." "As you wish." That was all he ever answered. "As you wish." "Fetch that, farm boy." "As you wish." "Dry this, farm boy." "As you wish." He lived in a hovel out near the animals, and according to Buttercup's mother, he kept it clean. He even read when he had candles. "I'll leave the lad an acre in my will." Buttercup's father was fond of saying they had acres then. "You'll spoil him," Buttercup's mother always answered. "He slaved for many years. Hard work should be rewarded." Then, rather than continue the argument, they had arguments then too. They would both turn on their daughter. "You didn't bathe," father said. I did, from Buttercup. "Not with water," father continued. "You reek like a stallion." "I've been writing all day," Buttercup explained. "You must bathe, Buttercup," her mother joined in. "The boys don't like their girls to smell of stables." "Oh, the boys," Buttercup fairly exploded. "I do not care about the boys. Horse loves me, and that is quite sufficient, thank you." She said that speech loud, and she said it often. But like it or not, things were beginning to happen. Shortly before her 16th birthday, Buttercup realized that it had now been more than a month since any girl in the village had spoken to her. She had never much been close to girls, so the change was nothing sharp. But at least before, there were head nods exchanged when she rode through the village or along the cart tracks. But now, for no reason, there was nothing. A quick glance away as she approached, that was all. Buttercup cornered Cornelia one morning in the blacksmith and asked about the silence. "I should think, after what you've done, you'd have the courtesy not to pretend to ask," came from Cornelia. And what have I done?" What? You've stolen them!" With that, Cornelia fled. But Buttercup understood. She knew who them was. The boys. The village boys. The beef-witted, feather-brained, rattle-skulled, clod-patted, dim-domed, noodle-noggined, sap-headed, long-knobbed boys. How could anybody accuse her of stealing them? Why would anybody want them anyway? What good were they? All they did was pester and vex and annoy. "Can I brush your house, Buttercup?" "Thank you, but the farm boy does that." "Can I go riding with you, Buttercup?" "Thank you, but I really do enjoy myself alone." "You think you're too good for anybody, don't you, Buttercup?" No, I don't. I just like riding by myself, that's all." But throughout her 16th year, even this kind of talk gave way to stammering and flushing and at the very best questions about the weather. "Do you think it's going to rain, Buttercup?" "I don't think so. The sky is blue." "Well, it might rain." "Yes, I suppose it might." "You think you're too good for anybody, don't you, Buttercup?" "No, I just don't think it's going to rain, that's all." At night, more often than not, they would congregate in the dark beyond her window and laugh about her. She ignored them. Usually the laughter would give way to insult. She paid them no mind. If they grew too damaging, the farm boy handled things, emerging silently from his hovel, thrashing a few of them, sending them flying. She never failed to thank him when he did this. "As you wish," was all he ever answered. When she was almost 17, a man in a carriage came to town and watched as she rode for provisions. He was still there on her return, peering out. She paid him no mind, and indeed by himself he was not important. But he marked her turning point. Other men had gone out of their way to catch sight of her. Other men had even ridden 20 miles for the privilege, as this man had. The importance here is that this was the first rich man who had bothered to do so, the first noble, and it was this man, whose name is lost to antiquity, who mentioned Buttercup to the Count. The land of Florin was set between where Sweden and Germany would eventually settle. This was before Europe. In theory, it was ruled by King Lothran and his second wife, the Queen. But in fact, the king was barely hanging on, could only rarely tell day from night, and basically spent his time in muttering. He was very old. Every organ in his body had long since betrayed him, and most of his important decisions regarding Florin had a certain arbitrary quality that bothered many of the leading citizens. Prince Humperdinck actually ran things. If there had been a Europe, he would have been the most powerful man in it. Even as it was, nobody within 1,000 miles wanted to mess with him. The Count was Prince Humperdinck's only confidant. His last name was Rugen, but no one needed to use it. He was the only count in the country, the title having been bestowed by the prince as a birthday present some years before, the happening taking place naturally at one of the countess' parties. The countess was considerably younger than her husband. All of her clothes came from Paris. This was after Paris, and she had superb taste. This was after taste too, but only just. And since it was such a new thing, and since the countess was the only lady in all Florin to possess it, is it any wonder she was the leading hostess of the land? Eventually, her passion for fabric and face paint caused her to settle permanently in Paris, where she ran the only salon of international consequence. For now she busied herself with simply sleeping on silk, eating on gold, and being the single most feared and admired woman in Florinese history. If she had figure faults, her clothes concealed them. If her face was less than divine, it was hard to tell once she got done applying substances. This was before glamour. But if it hadn't been for ladies like the Countess, there would never have been a need for its invention. In sum, the Rugens were couple of the week in Florin and had been for many years. "Quick, quick, come!" Buttercup's father stood in his farmhouse staring at the window. "Why?" This from the mother. She gave away nothing when it came to obedience. The father made a quick finger point. "Look!" "You look, you know how." Buttercup's parents did not have exactly what you might call a happy marriage. All they ever dreamed of was leaving each other. Buttercup's father shrugged and went back to the window. "Ah," he said after a while, and a little later again, "Ah." Buttercup's mother glanced up briefly from her cooking. "Such riches," Buttercup's father said. "Glorious." Buttercup's mother hesitated, then put her stew spoon down. This was after stew, but so is everything. When the first man first clambered from the slime and made his first home on land, what he had for supper that first night was stew. "The heart swells at the magnificence," Buttercup's father muttered very loudly. "What exactly is a dumpling?" Buttercup's mother wanted to know. "You look, you know how," was all he replied. This was their 33rd spat of the day. This was long after spats, and he was behind, 13 to 20. But he had made up a lot of distance since lunch, and when it was 17 to 2 against him. "Donkey," the mother said, and came over to the window. A moment later she was going, "Ah," right along with him. They stood there, the two of them, tiny and awed. From setting the dinner table, Buttercup watched them. They must be going to meet Prince Humperdinck's. Some place, Buttercup's mother said. The father nodded. Hunting, that's what the prince does. How lucky we are to have seen them pass by, Buttercup's mother said, and she took her husband's hand. The old man nodded. Now I can die. She glanced at him. Don't. Her tone was surprisingly tender, and probably she sensed how important he really was to her, because when he did die 2 years further on, she went right after, and most of the people who knew her well agreed it was the sudden lack of opposition that undid her. Buttercup came close and stood behind them, staring over them, and soon she was gasping too, because the Count and Countess and all their pages and soldiers and servants and courtiers and champions and carriages were passing by the cart track at the front of the farm. The three stood in silence as the procession moved forward. Buttercup's father was a tiny mutt of a man who had always dreamed of living like the Count. He had once been 2 miles from where the Count and Prince had been hunting, and until this moment that had been the high point of his life. He was a terrible farmer, and not much of a husband either. There wasn't really much in this world he excelled at, and he could never quite figure out how he happened to sire his daughter. But he knew deep down that it must have been some kind of wonderful mistake, the nature of which he had no intention of investigating. Buttercup's mother was a gnarled shrimp of a woman, thorny and worrying, who had always dreamed of somehow just once being popular like the Countess was said to be. She was a terrible cook, and even more limited housekeeper. How Buttercup slid from her womb was of course beyond her, but she had been there when it happened. That was enough for her. Buttercup herself, standing half ahead of her parents, still holding the dinner dishes, still smelling of horse, only wished that the great procession wasn't quite so far away, so she could see if the Countess' clothes really were all that lovely. As if in answer to her request, the procession turned and began entering the farm. Here, Buttercup's father managed. My God, why? Buttercup's mother whirled on him. Did you forget to pay your taxes? This was after taxes, but everything is after taxes. Taxes were here even before the stew. Even if I did, they wouldn't need all that to collect them. And he gestured towards the front of his farm, where now the Count and Countess and all their pages and soldiers and servants and courtiers and champions and carriages were coming closer and closer. What could they want to ask me about? He said. Go see. Buttercup's mother told him. You go, please. No, you, please. We'll both go. They both went, trembling. Cows, the Count said when they reached his golden carriage. I would like to talk about your cows. He spoke from inside, his dark face darkened by shadow. My cows, Buttercup's father said. Yes, you see, I'm thinking of starting a little dairy of my own, and since your cows are known throughout the land as being Florence's finest, I thought I might pry your secrets from you. My cows, Buttercup's father managed to repeat, hoping he was not going mad. Because the truth was, and he knew it well, he had terrible cows. For years, nothing but complaints from the people in the village. If anyone else had had milk to sell, he would have been out of business in a minute. Now granted, things had improved since the farm boy had come to slave for him, no question. The farm boy had certain skills, and the complaints were quite non-existent now. But that didn't make his the finest cows in Florin. Still, you didn't argue with the Count. Buttercup's father turned to his wife. What would you say my secret is, my dear? He asked. Oh, there are so many, she said. She was no dummy, not when it came to the quality of their livestock. You two are childless, are you? The Count asked then. No, sir, the mother answered. Then let me see her, the Count went on. Perhaps she'll be quicker with her answers than her parents. Buttercup, the father called, turning. Come out, please. How did you know we had a daughter? Buttercup's mother wondered. A guess. I assumed he had to be one or the other. Some days I'm luckier than... He simply stopped talking then, because Buttercup moved into view, hurrying from the house to her parents. The Count left the carriage. Gracefully he moved to the ground and stood very still. He was a big man with black hair and black eyes and great shoulders and a black cape and gloves. Curtsy, dear, Buttercup's mother whispered. Buttercup did her best, and the Count could not stop looking at her. Understand now, she was barely rated in the top 20. Her hair was uncombed, unclean, her age was just 17, so there was still in occasional places the remains of baby fat. Nothing had been done to the child, nothing was really there but potential. But the Count still could not rip his eyes away. The Count would like to know the secrets behind our cow's greatness. Is that not correct, sir? Buttercup's father said. The Count only nodded, staring. Even Buttercup's mother noted a certain tension in the air. Ask the farm boy. He tends them, Buttercup said. And is that the farm boy? Came a new voice from inside the carriage. Then the Countess' face was framed in the carriage doorway. Her lips were painted a perfect red, her green eyes lined in black. All the colours of the world were muted in a gown. Buttercup wanted to shield her eyes from the brilliance. Buttercup's father glanced back towards the lone figure, peering around the corner of the house. It is. Bring him to me. He is not dressed properly for such an occasion, Buttercup's mother said. I've seen bare chests before, the Countess replied. Then she called out, You, and pointed at the farm boy. Come here. Her fingers snapped on here. The farm boy did as he was told, and when he was close, the Countess left the carriage. When he was a few paces behind Buttercup, he stopped, head properly bowed. He was ashamed of his attire. Worn boots and torn blue jeans. Blue jeans were invented considerably before most people suppose, and his hands were tied together in almost a gesture of supplication. Have you name, farm boy? Wesley, Countess. Well, Wesley, perhaps you can help us with our problem. She crossed to him. The fabric of her gown grazed his skin. We're all of us here passionately interested in the subject of cows. We're practically reaching the point of frenzy, such as our curiosity. Why do you suppose, Wesley, that the cows of this particular farm are the finest in all Florin? What do you do to them? I just feed them, Countess. Well then, there it is. The mystery is solved. The secret out. We can all rest. Clearly the magic is in Wesley's feeding. Show me how you do it, would you, Wesley? Feed the cows for you, Countess. Bright lad. When? Now will be soon enough. And she held out her arm to him. Lead me, Wesley. Wesley had no choice but to take her arm. Gently. It's behind the house, madam. It's terribly muddy back there. Your gown will be ruined. I wear them only once, Wesley, and I burn to see you in action. So off they went to the cowshed. Throughout all this, the Count kept watching Buttercup. I'll help you, Buttercup called after Wesley. Perhaps I'd best see just how he does it, the Count decided. Strange things are happening, Buttercup's parents said, and off they went too, bringing up the rear of the cow-feeding trip. Watching the Count, who was watching their daughter, who was watching the Countess, who was watching Wesley. I couldn't see what he did that was so special, Buttercup's father said. He just fed them. This was after dinner now, and the family was alone again. They must like him personally. I had a cat once that only bloomed when I fed him. Maybe it's the same kind of thing. Buttercup's mother scraped the stew leavings into a bowl. Here, she said to her daughter, Wesley's waiting by the back door. Take him his dinner. Buttercup carried the bowl, opened the back door. Take it, she said. He nodded, accepted, started off to his tree stump to eat. I didn't excuse you, farm boy, Buttercup began. He stopped, turned back to her. I don't know what you're doing with a horse. What you're not doing with horse is more to the point. I want him clean, tonight. I want his hooves varnished, tonight. I want his tail plaited and his ears massaged, this very evening. I want his stable spotless, now. I want him glistening, and if it takes you all night, it takes you all night. As you wish. She slammed the door and let him eat in darkness. I thought Horse had been looking very well, actually, her father said. Buttercup said nothing. You yourself said so yesterday, her mother reminded her. I must be overtired, Buttercup managed, the excitement and all. Rest then, her mother cautioned. Terrible things can happen when you're overtired. I was overtired the night your father proposed. 34 to 22, and pulling away. Buttercup went to her room. She lay in her bed. She closed her eyes, and the Countess was staring at Wesley. Buttercup got up from bed. She took off her clothes. She washed a little. She got into her nightgown. She slipped between the sheets, snuggled down, closed her eyes. The Countess was still staring at Wesley. Buttercup drew back the sheets, opened her door. She went to the sink by the stove and poured herself a cup of water. She drank it down. She poured another cup and rolled its coolness across her forehead. The feverish feeling was still there. How feverish? She felt fine. She was 17 and not even a cavity. She dumped the water firmly into the sink, turned, marched back to her room, shut the door tight, went back to bed. She closed her eyes. The Countess would not stop staring at Wesley. Why? Why in the world would the woman in all the history of Florin, who was in all ways perfect, be interested in the farm boy? Buttercup rolled around in bed, and there simply was no other way of explaining that look. She was interested. Buttercup shut her eyes tight and studied the memory of the Countess. Clearly something about the farm boy interested her. Facts were facts. But what? The farm boy had eyes like the sea before a storm. But who cared about eyes? And he had pale blonde hair, we like that sort of thing. And he was broad enough in the shoulders, but not all that much broader than the Count. And certainly he was muscular, but anybody would be muscular who slaved all day. And his skin was perfect and tan, but that came again from slaving. In the sun all day, who wouldn't be tan? And he wasn't that much taller than the Count either, although his stomach was flatter, but that was because the farm boy was younger. Buttercup sat up in bed. It must be his teeth. The farm boy did have good teeth. Give credit where credit was due. White and perfect, particularly set against the sun-tanned face. Could it have been anything else? Buttercup concentrated. The girls in the village followed the farm boy around a lot whenever he was making deliveries, but they were idiots. They followed anything. And he always ignored them, because if he'd ever opened his mouth, they would have realized that was all he had, just good teeth. He was, after all, exceptionally stupid. It was really very strange that a woman as beautiful and slender and willowy and graceful, a creature as perfectly packaged, as supremely dressed as the Countess, should be hung up on teeth that way. Buttercup shrugged. People were surprisingly complicated. But now she had it all diagnosed, deduced, clear. She closed her eyes and snuggled down and got all nice and comfortable, and people don't look at other people the way the Countess looked at the farm boy because of their teeth. "Oh," Buttercup gasped. Oh dear." Now the farm boy was staring back at the Countess. He was feeding the cows, and his muscles were rippling the way they always did under his tan skin, and Buttercup was standing there watching as the farm boy looked, for the first time, deep into the Countess' eyes. Buttercup jumped out of bed and began to pace her room. How could he? Oh, it was all right if he looked at her, but he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at her. "She's so old," Buttercup muttered, starting to storm a bit now. The Countess would never see 30 again, that was fact. And her dress looked ridiculous out in the cowshed, and that was fact too. Buttercup fell into her bed and clutched her pillow across her breast. The dress was ridiculous before it ever got to the cowshed. The Countess looked rotten the minute she left the carriage, and her two big painted mouth, and her little piggy painted eyes, and her powder skin, and flailing and trashing, Buttercup wept and tossed and paced and wept some more, and there have been 3 great cases of jealousy since David of Galilee was first afflicted with the emotion when he could no longer stand the fact that his neighbor Saul's cactus outshone his own. Originally, jealousy pertained solely to plants, other people's cactus or ginkgos, or later, when there was grass, which is why, even to this day, we say that someone is green with jealousy. Buttercup's case rated a close 4th on the all-time list. It was a very long and very green night. She was outside his hovel before dawn. Inside, she could hear him already awake. She knocked. He appeared, stood in the doorway. Behind him she could see a tiny candle, open books. He waited. She looked at him. Then she looked away. He was too beautiful. "I love you," Buttercup said. "I know this must come as something of a surprise, since all I've ever done is scorn you, and degrade you, and taunt you. But I've loved you for several hours now, and every second more. I thought an hour ago that I loved you more than any woman has ever loved a man, but a half hour after that I knew that what I felt before was nothing compared to what I felt then. But then 10 minutes after that I understood that my previous love was a puddle compared to the high seas before a storm. Your eyes are like that, did you know? Well, they are. How many minutes ago was I? 20? Had I brought my feelings up to then? It doesn't matter." Buttercup still could not look at him. The sun was rising behind her now. She could feel the heat on her back, and it gave her courage. "I love you so much more now than 20 minutes ago that there cannot be comparison. I love you so much more now than when you opened your hovel door. There cannot be comparison. There is no room in my body for anything but you. My arms love you, my ears adore you, my knees shake with blind affection, my mind begs you to ask it something so it can obey. Do you want me to follow you for the rest of your days? I will do that. Do you want me to crawl? I will crawl. I'll be quiet for you, or sing for you, or if you're hungry, let me bring you food. Or if you have thirst and nothing will quench it but Arabian wine, I will go to Araby, even though it is across the world, and bring a bottle back for your lunch. Anything there is that I can do for you, I will do for you. Anything there is that I cannot do, I will learn to do. I know I cannot compete with the Countess in skills, or wisdom, or appeal. And I saw the way she looked at you, and I saw the way you looked at her. But remember, please, that she is old and has other interests. Well, I'm 17, and for me, there is only you. Dearest Wesley, I've never called you that before, have I? Wesley, 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 darling Wesley, adored Wesley, sweet, perfect Wesley. Whisper that I have a chance to win your love." And with that she did the bravest thing she'd ever done. She looked right into his eyes. He closed the door in her face, without a word, without a word. Buttercup ran. She whirled and burst away, and the tears came bitterly. She could not see. She stumbled. She slammed into a tree trunk, fell, rose, ran on. Her shoulder throbbed from where the tree trunk hit her, and the pain was strong, but not enough to ease her shattered heart. Back to her room she fled, back to her pillow. Safe behind the locked door, she drenched the world with tears. Not even one word. He hadn't had the decency for that. Sorry, he could have said. Would it have ruined him to say sorry? Too late, he could have said. Why couldn't he at least have said something? Buttercup thought very hard about that for a moment, and suddenly she had the answer. He didn't talk because the minute he opened his mouth, that was it. Sure, he was handsome, but dumb. The minute he had exercised his tongue, it would have all been over. Duh. That's what he would have said. That was the kind of thing Wesley came out with when he was feeling really sharp. Duh. Thanks, Buttercup. Buttercup dried her tears and began to smile. She took a deep breath, heaved a sigh. It was all part of growing up. You got these little quick passions, you blinked, and they were gone. You forgave faults, found perfection, fell madly, then the next day the sun came up and it was over. Chalk it up to experience, old girl, and get on with the morning. Buttercup stood, made her bed, changed her clothes, combed her hair, smiled, and burst out again in a fit of weeping, because there was a limit to just how much you could lie to yourself. Wesley wasn't stupid. Oh, she could pretend he was. She could laugh about his difficulties with the language. She could chide herself for her silly infatuations with a dullard. The truth was simply this. He has a head on his shoulders, with a brain inside every bit as good as his teeth. There was a reason he hadn't spoken, and he had nothing to do with Grey cells working. He hadn't spoken because really there was nothing for him to say. He didn't love her back, and that was that. The tears that kept Buttercup company the remainder of the day were not at all like those that had blinded her into the tree trunk. Those were noisy and hot. They pulsed. These were silent and steady, and all they did was remind her that she wasn't good enough. She was 17, and every male she'd ever known had crumbled at her feet, and it meant nothing. The one time it mattered, she wasn't good enough. All she knew really was riding, and how was that to interest a man when that man had been looked at by the Countess? It was dusk when she heard footsteps outside her door. Then a knock. Buttercup dried her eyes. Another knock. "Whoever is that?" Buttercup yawned finally. "Wesley." Buttercup lounged across the bed. "Wesley," she said. "Do I know any Oh, a farm boy. It's you. How droll." She went to her door, unlocked it, and said in her fanciest tone, "I'm ever so glad you stopped by. I've been feeling just ever so slummy about the little joke I played on you this morning. Of course you know I wasn't for a moment serious, or at least I thought you knew. But then just when you started closing the door, I thought for one dreary instant that perhaps I'd done my little jest a bit too convincingly. And poor dear thing, you might have thought I meant what I said, when of course we both know the total impossibility of that ever happening. I've come to say goodbye." Buttercup's heart bucked, but she still held to fancy. "You're going to sleep, you mean? And you've come to say good night? How thoughtful of you, farm boy, showing me that you forgive me for my little morning's tease. I certainly appreciate your thoughtfulness," and he cut her off. "I'm leaving." "Leaving?" The floor began to ripple. She held to the door frame. "Now?" "Yes." "Because of what I said this morning?" "Yes." "I frightened you away, didn't I?" "I could kill my tongue." She shook her head and shook her head. "Well, it's done. You've made your decision. Just remember this. I won't take you back when she's done with you. I don't care if you beg." He just looked at her. Buttercup hurried on. "Just because you're beautiful and perfect, it's made you conceited. You think people can get tired of you. Well, you're wrong. They can, and she will. Besides, you're too poor." "I'm going to America to seek my fortune." This was just after America, but long after fortunes. "A ship sails soon from London. There is great opportunity in America. I'm going to take advantage of it. I've been training myself. In my hovel, I've taught myself not to need sleep. A few hours only. I'll take a 10-hour-a-day job, and then I'll take another 10-hour-a-day job. And I'll save every penny from both, except what I need to eat to keep strong. And when I have enough, I'll buy a farm and build a house and make a bed big enough for two." "You're just crazy if you think she's going to be happy in some run-down farmhouse in America, not with what she spends on clothes." "Stop talking about the Countess as a special favor before you drive me mad." Buttercup looked at him. "Don't you understand anything that's going on?" Buttercup shook her head. Wesley shook his too. "You never have been the brightest, I guess." "Do you love me, Wesley? Is that it?" He couldn't believe it. "Do I love you? My God! If your love were a grain of sand, mine would be a universe of beaches. If your love were—" "I don't understand the first one yet," Buttercup interrupted. She was starting to get very excited now. "Let me get this straight. Are you saying my love is the size of a grain of sand and yours is this other thing? Images just confuse me so. Is this universal business of yours bigger than my sand? Help me, Wesley. I have the feeling we're on the verge of something just terribly important." "I have stayed these years in my hovel because of you. I've taught myself languages because of you. I've made my body strong because I thought you might be pleased by a strong body. I've lived my life with only the prayer that some sudden dawn you might glance in my direction. I have not known a moment in years when the sight of you did not send my heart careening against my ribcage. I have not known a night when your visage did not accompany me to sleep. There has not been a morning when you did not flutter behind my waking eyelids. Is any of this getting through to you, Buttercup? Or do you want me to go on for a while? Never stop. There has not been. If you're teasing me, Wesley, I'm just going to kill you. How can you even dream I might be teasing? Well, you haven't once said you loved me. That's all you need? Easy. I love you, okay? Want it louder? I love you. Spell it out, should I? I-L-O-V-E-Y-O-U. Want it backward? You love I. You're teasing now, aren't you? A little, maybe. I've been saying it so long to you, you just wouldn't listen. Every time you said, "Fun boy, do this," you thought I was answering as you wish. But that's only because you were hearing it wrong. I love you was what it was, but you never heard. And you never heard. I hear you now, and I promise you this, I will never love anyone else. Only Wesley, until I die. He nodded, took a step away. I'll send for you soon, believe me. Would my Wesley ever lie? He took another step. I'm late. I must go. I hate it, but I must. The ship sails soon, and London is far. I understand. He reached out with his right hand. Buttercup found it very hard to breathe. Goodbye. She managed to raise her right hand to his. They shook. Goodbye, he said again. She made a little nod. He took a third step, not turning. She watched him. He turned, and the words ripped out of her. Without one kiss? They fell into each other's arms. Now there have been 5 great kisses since 1642 BC, when Saul and Delilah Corns' inadvertent discoveries swept across Western civilization. Before then, couples hooked thumbs, and the precise rating of kisses is a terribly difficult thing, often leading to great controversy, because although everyone agrees with the formula of affection times purity times intensity times duration, no one has ever been completely satisfied with how much weight each element should receive. But on any system, there are 5 that everyone agrees deserve full marks. Well, this one left them all behind. The first morning after Wesley's departure, Buttercup thought she was entitled to do nothing more than sit around moping and feeling sorry for herself. After all, the love of her life had fled. Life had no meaning. How could she face the future, etc., etc.? But after about 2 seconds of that, she realized that Wesley was out in the world now, getting nearer and nearer to London. And what if a beautiful city girl caught his fancy while she was just back here mouldering? Or worse, what if he got to America and worked his jobs and built his farm and made their bed and sent for her, and when she got there he would look at her and say, I'm sending you back. The moping has destroyed your eyes. The self-pity has taken your skin. You slobby-looking creature. I'm marrying an Indian girl who lives in a teepee nearby and is always in the peak of condition. Buttercup ran to a bedroom mirror. Oh, Wesley, she said, I must never disappoint you. And she hurried downstairs to where her parents were squabbling, 16 to 13, and not past breakfast yet. I need your advice, she interrupted. What can I do to improve my personal appearance? Start by bathing, her father said. And do something with your hair while you're at it, her mother said. Unearth the territory behind your ears. Neglect not your knees. That will do nicely for starters, Buttercup said. She shook her head. Gracious, but it isn't easy being tidy. Undaunted, she set to work. Every morning she awoke, if possible by dawn, and got the farm chores finished immediately. There was much to be done now, with Wesley gone, and more than that ever since the Count had visited. Everyone in the area had increased his milk order, so there was no time for self-improvement until well into the afternoon. But then she really set to work. First a good cold bath, then while her hair was drying, she would slave after fixing her figure folds. One of her elbows was just too bony, the opposite wrist not bony enough. And exercise what remained of her baby fat, little left now, she was nearly 18, and brush her hair. Her hair was the color of autumn, and it had never been cut, So 1,000 strokes took time, but she didn't mind, because Wesley had never seen it clean like this, and wouldn't he be surprised when she stepped off the boat in America? Her skin was the color of wintry cream, and she scrubbed her every inch well past glistening, and that wasn't much fun really, but wouldn't Wesley be pleased with how clean she was as she stepped off the boat in America? And very quickly now her potential began to be realized. From 20 years, she jumped within 2 weeks to 15, an unheard of change in such a time. But 3 weeks after that, she was already ninth and moving. The competition was tremendous now, but the day after she was ninth, a 3-page letter arrived from Wesley in London, and just reading it over put her up to eighth. That was really what was doing it for her more than anything. Her love for Wesley would not stop growing, and people were dazzled when she delivered milk in the morning. Some people were only able to gape at her, but many talked, and those that did found her warmer and gentler than she had ever been before. Even the village girls would nod and smile now, and some of them would ask after Wesley, which was a mistake unless you happened to have a lot of spare time, because when someone asked Buttercup how Wesley was, well, she told them he was supreme as usual, he was spectacular, he was singularly fabulous. Oh, she could go on for hours. Sometimes he got a little tough for the listeners to maintain strict attention, but they did their best, since Buttercup loved him so completely. Which was why Wesley's death hit her the way it did. He had written to her just before he sailed for America. The Queen's Pride was his ship, and he loved her. That was the way his sentences always went. It is raining today, and I love you. My cold is better, and I love you. Say hello to horse, and I love you. Like that. Then there were no letters, but that was natural. He was at sea. And then she heard. She came home from delivering the milk, and her parents were wooden. Off the Carolina coast, her father whispered. Her mother whispered, without warning, at night. What? From Buttercup. Pirates, said her father. Buttercup thought she'd better sit down, quiet in the room. He's been taken prisoner then, Buttercup managed. Her mother made a no. It was Roberts, father said. The dread pirate Roberts. Oh, Buttercup said, the one who never leaves survivors. Yes, her father said, quiet in the room. Suddenly Buttercup was talking very fast. Was he stabbed? Did he drown? Did they cut his throat to sleep? Did they wake him, do you suppose? Perhaps they whipped him dead. She stood up then. I'm getting silly, forgive me. She shook her head, as if the way they got him mattered. Excuse me, please. With that she hurried to her room. She stayed there many days. At first her parents tried to lure her, but she would not have it. They took to leaving food outside her room, and she took bits and shreds, enough to stay alive. There was never noise inside, no wailing, no bitter sounds. And when she at last came out, her eyes were dry. Her parents stared up from their silent breakfast at her. They both started to rise, but she put a hand out, stopped them. I can care for myself, please. And she said about getting some food. They watched her closely. In point of fact, she had never looked as well. She had entered her room as just an impossibly lovely girl. The woman who emerged was a trifle thinner, a great deal wiser, an ocean sadder. This one understood the nature of pain, and beneath the glory of her features there was character and a sure knowledge of suffering. She was 18. She was the most beautiful woman in 100 years. She didn't seem to care. You're right, Mother asked. Buttercup sipped her cocoa. Fine, she said. You're sure? Father wondered. Yes, Buttercup replied. There was a very long pause. But I must never love again. She never did. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. The Groom. Prince Humperdinck was shaped like a barrel. His chest was a great barrel chest, his thighs mighty barrel thighs. He was not tall, but he weighed close to 250 pounds, brick hard. He walked like a crab, side to side, And probably if he had wanted to be a ballet dancer, he would have been doomed to a miserable life of endless frustration. But he didn't want to be a ballet dancer. He wasn't in that much of a hurry to be king either. Even war, at which he excelled, took second place in his affections. Everything took second place in his affections. Hunting was his love. He made it a practice never to let a day go by without killing something. It didn't much matter what. When he first grew dedicated, he killed only big things, elephants or pythons. But then as his skills increased, he began to enjoy the suffering of little beasts too. He could happily spend an afternoon tracking a flying squirrel across forests or a rainbow trout down rivers. Once he was determined, once he had focused on an object, the prince was relentless. He never tired, never wavered, neither ate nor slept. It was death chess and he was international grandmaster. In the beginning, he traversed the world for opposition. But travel consumed time, ships and horses being what they were, and the time away from Florin was worrying. There always had to be a male heir to the throne, and as long as his father was alive, there was no problem. But someday his father would die, and then the prince would be the king, and he would have to select a queen to supply an heir for the day of his own death. So to avoid the problem of absence, Prince Humperdinck built the Zoo of Death. He designed it himself with Count Rugen's help, and he sent his hirelings across the world to stock it for him. It was kept brimming with things they could hunt, and it really wasn't like any other animal sanctuary anywhere. In the first place, there were never any visitors, only the albino keeper to make sure the beasts were properly fed, and that there was never any sickness or weakness inside. The other thing about the zoo was that it was underground. The prince picked the spot himself, in the quietest, remotest corner of the castle grounds. And he decreed there were to be 5 levels, all with the proper needs for his individual enemies. On the first level he put enemies of speed, wild dogs, cheetahs, hummingbirds. On the second level belonged the enemies of strength, anacondas and rhinos and crocodiles of over 20 feet. The third level was for poisoners, spitting cobras, jumping spiders, death bats galore. The fourth level was the kingdom of the most dangerous, the enemies of fear. The shrieking tarantula, the only spider capable of sound. The blood eagle, the only bird that thrived on human flesh. Plus, in its own black pool, the sucking squid. Even the albinos shivered during feeding time at the 4th level. The 5th level was empty. The prince constructed it in the hopes of someday finding something worthy, something as dangerous and fierce and powerful as he was. Unlikely. Still, he was an eternal optimist, so he kept the great cage of the 5th level always in readiness. And there was really more than enough that was lethal on the other 4 levels to keep a man happy. The prince would sometimes choose his prey by luck. He had a great wheel with a spinner, and on the outside of the wheel was a picture of every animal in the zoo, and he would twirl the spinner at breakfast, and wherever it stopped, the albino would ready that breed. Sometimes he would choose by mood. I feel quick today. Fetch me a cheetah. Or I feel strong today. Release a rhino. And whatever he requested, of course, was done. He was ringing down the curtain on an orangutan when the business of the king's health made its ultimate intrusion. It was mid-afternoon, and the prince had been grappling with the giant beast since morning. And finally, after all these hours, the hairy thing was weakening. Again and again the monkey tried to bite, a sure sign of failure of strength in his arms. The prince warded off the attempted bites with ease, and the ape was heaving in the chest now, desperate for air. The prince made a crab-like step sidewise, then another, then darted forward, spun the great beast into his arms, began applying pressure to the spine. This was all taking place in the ape pit, where the prince had his pleasure with any simians. From up above now, Count Rugen's voice interrupted. "There is news," the count said. From Bethel, the prince replied. Cannot it wait? For how long? Asked the count. Crack! The orangutan fell like a rag doll. Now what is all this? The prince replied, stepping past the dead beast, mounting the ladder out of the pit. Your father has had his annual physical, the count said. I have the report. And? Your father is dying. Drat, said the prince, that means I shall have to get married. Chapter 3. The Courtship. 4 of them met in the great council room of the castle. Prince Humperdinck, his confidant Count Rugen, his father, aging King of Lotharon, and Queen Bella, his evil stepmother. Queen Bella was shaped like a gumdrop and colored like a raspberry. She was easily the most beloved person in the kingdom, and had been married to the king long before he began mumbling. Prince Humperdinck was but a child then, and since the only stepmothers he knew were the evil ones from stories, he always called Bella that, or E.S. for short. All right, the prince began when they were all assembled. Who do I marry? Let's pick a bride and get it done. Aging King Lotharon said, I've been thinking it's really getting to be about time for Humperdinck to pick a bride. He didn't actually so much say that as mumble it. Queen Bella was the only one who bothered ferreting out his meanings any more. You couldn't be righter, dear, she said, and she patted his royal robes. What did he say? He said whoever we decided on would be getting a thunderously handsome prince for a lifetime companion. Tell him he's looking quite well himself, the prince returned. We've only just changed Miracle Man, the queen said. That accounts for the improvement. You mean you fired Miracle Max? Prince Humperdinck said. I thought he was the only one left. No, but we found another one up in the mountains, and he's quite extraordinary. Old, of course, but then who wants a young Miracle Man? Tell him I've changed Miracle Man, King Lotharon said. It came out, Tell mumble, mumble, mumble. What did he say? The prince wondered. He said a man of your importance couldn't marry just any princess. True, Prince Humperdinck said. He sighed deeply. I suppose that means Norina. That would certainly be a perfect match politically. Count Rugen allowed. Princess Norina was from Gilda, the country that lay just across Florine Channel. In Gilda they put it differently. For them, Florine was the country on the other side of the Channel of Gilda. In any case, the two countries had stayed alive over the centuries mainly by warring on each other. There had been the Olive War, the tuna fish discrepancy, which almost bankrupted both nations, the Roman Rift, which did send them both into insolvency, only to be followed by the Discord of the Emeralds, in which they both got rich again, chiefly by banding together for a brief period and robbing everybody within sailing distance. I wonder if she hunts, though, said Humperdinck. I don't care so much about personality, just so they're good with a knife. I saw her several years ago, Queen Bella said. She seemed lovely, though hardly muscular. I would describe her more as a knitter than a doer, but again, lovely. Skin? Asked the prince. Marblish, answered the queen. Lips? Number or color? Asked the queen. Color, E.S. Rosish. Cheeks the same. Eyes largish. One blue, one green. Said Humperdinck. And form? Hourglass-ish. Always clothed divinishly. And of course famous throughout Gilda for the largest hat collection in the world. Well, let's bring her over here for some state occasion and have a look at her, said the prince. Isn't there a princess in Gilda that will be about the right age? Said the king. It came out Moses Mumble. Are you never wrong? Said Queen Bella, and she smiled into the weakening eyes of her ruler. "What did he say?" wondered the prince. "That I should leave this very day with an invitation," replied the queen. So began the great visit of the Princess Norina. What happens is just this. Queen Bella packs most of her wardrobe, 11 pages, and travels to Gilda, 2 pages. In Gilda, she unpacks 5 pages, then tenders the invitation to Princess Norina, 1 page. Princess Norina accepts, 1 page. Then Princess Norina packs all her clothes and hats, 23 pages, and together the princess and the queen travel back to Florin for the annual celebration of the founding of Florin city, 1 page. They reach King Lothron's castle, where Princess Norina is shown her quarters, half page, and unpacks all the same clothes and hats we've just seen her pack 1.5 pages before, 12 pages. Anyway, things pick up a bit once the prince and princess meet and spend the day. Norina did have, as advertised, marblish skin, rose-ish lips and cheeks, large-ish eyes, 1 blue, 1 green, hourglass-ish form, and easily the most extraordinary collection of hats ever assembled. Wide-brimmed and narrow, some tall, some not, some fancy, some colorful, some plaid, some plain. She doted on changing hats at every opportunity. When she met the prince, she was wearing 1 hat. When he asked her for a stroll, she excused herself, shortly to return wearing another, equally flattering. Things went on like this throughout the day. Dinner was held in the great hall of Lothron's castle. Ordinarily, they would all have supped in the dining room, but for an event of this importance, that place was simply too small. So tables were placed end to end along the center of the great hall, an enormous draughty spot that was given to being chilly even in the summertime. There were many doors and giant entranceways, and the wind gust sometimes reached gale force. This night was more typical than less. The winds whistled constantly, and the candles constantly needed relighting, and some of the more daringly dressed ladies shivered. But Prince Humperdinck didn't seem to mind, and in Florin, if you didn't either. At 8:23, there seemed every chance of a lasting alliance starting between Florin and Gilda. At 8:24, the 2 nations were very close to war. What happened was simply this. At 8:23 and 5 seconds, the main course of the evening was ready for serving. The main course was essence of brandied pig, and you need a lot of it to serve 500 people. So in order to hasten the serving, a giant double door that led from the kitchen to the great hall was opened. The giant double door was on the north end of the room. The door remained open throughout what followed. The proper wine for essence of brandied pig was in readiness behind the double door that led eventually to the wine cellar. This double door was opened at 8:23 and 10 seconds in order that the dozen wine stewards could get their kegs quickly to the eaters. This double door, it might be noted, was at the south end of the room. At this point, an unusually strong crosswind was clearly evident. Prince Humperdinck didn't notice, because at that moment he was whispering with the Princess Norina of Gilda. He was cheek to cheek with her, his head under her wide-brimmed blue-green hat, which brought out the exquisite color in both of her large-ish eyes. At 8:23 and 20 seconds, King Lothron made his somewhat belated entrance to the dinner. He was always belated now, had been for years, and in the past people had been known to starve before he got there. But of late, meals just began without him, which was fine with him, since his new miracle man had taken him off meals anyway. The king entered through the king's door, a huge hinged thing that only he was allowed to use. It took several servants in excellent condition to work it. It should be reported that the king's door was always on the east side of any room, since the king was, of all people, closest to the sun. What happened then has been variously described as a norther or a southwester, depending on where he was seated in the room when it struck, but all hands agree on one thing. At 8:23 and 25 seconds, It was pretty gusty in the great hall. Most of the candles lost their flames and toppled, which was only important because a few of them fell, still burning, into the small kerosene cups that were placed here and there across the banquet table, so that the essence of branded pig could be properly flaming when served. Servants rushed in from all over to put out the flames, and they did a good enough job considering that everything in the room was flying this way, that way, fans and scarves and hats. Particularly the hat of Princess Norina. It flew off to the wall behind her, where she quickly retrieved it and put it properly on. That was at 8:23 and 50 seconds. It was too late. At 8:23:55 seconds, Prince Humperdinck rose roaring, the veins in his thick neck edged like hemp. There were still flames in some places, and their redness reddened his already blood-filled face. He looked, as he stood there, like a barrel on fire. He then said to Princess Norina of Gilda the 5 words that brought the nations to the brink. "Madam, feel free to flee," and with that he stormed from the great hall. The time was then 8:24. Prince Humperdinck made his angry way to the balcony above the great hall and stared down at the chaos. The fires were still in places, flaming red. Guests were pouring out through the doors, and Princess Norina, hatted and faint, was being carried by her servants far from view. Queen Bella finally caught up with the prince, who stormed along the balcony, clearly not yet in control. "I do wish you hadn't been quite so blunt," Queen Bella said. The prince whirled on her. "I'm not marrying any bald princess, and that's that." "No one would know," Queen Bella explained. "She has hats even for sleeping." "I would know," cried the prince. "Did you see the candlelight reflecting off her skull?" "But things would have been so good with Gilda," the queen said, addressing herself half to the prince, half to Count Rugen, who now joined them. "Forget about Gilda. I'll conquer it sometime. I've been wanting to ever since I was a kid anyway." He approached the queen. "People snicker behind your back when you've got a bold wife, and I can do without that, thank you. Just have to find someone else." "Who?" "Find me somebody. She should just look nice, that's all." "That Norina has no hair," King Lothran said, puffing up to the others. "Rumble, mumble, humble." "Thank you for pointing that out, dear," said Queen Bella. "I don't think Humperdinck will like that," said the king. "Dumble, humble, mumble." Then Count Rugen stepped forward. "You want someone who looks nice, but what if she is a commoner?" "The commoner, the better," Prince Humperdinck replied, pacing again. "What if she can't hunt?" the count went on. "I don't care if she can't spell," the prince said. Suddenly he stopped and faced them all. "I'll tell you what I want," he began then. "I want someone who is so beautiful that when you see her, you say, 'Wow, that Humperdinck must be some kind of fella to have a wife like that.' Search the country, search the world, just find her." Count Rugen could only smile. "She's already found," he said. It was dawn when the 2 horsemen reined in at the hilltop. Count Rugen rode a splendid black horse, large, perfect, powerful. The prince rode one of his whites. It made Rugen's mount seem like a plough puller. "She delivers milk in the mornings," Count Rugen said. "And she's truly, without question, no possibility of error, beautiful." "She was something of a mess when I saw her," the count admitted, "but the potential was overwhelming." "A milkmaid." The prince ran the words across his rough tongue. "I don't know that I could wed one of them, even under the best of conditions. People might snicker that it was the best I could do." "True," the count admitted. "If you prefer, we can ride back to Florence City without waiting." "We've come this far," the prince said. "We might as well wait." His voice quite simply died. "I'll take her," he managed, finally, as Buttercup rode slowly by below them. "No one will snicker, I think," the count said. "I must court her now," said the prince. "Leave us alone for a minute." He rode the white expertly down the hill. Buttercup had never seen such a giant beast, or such a rider. "I am your prince, and you will marry me," Humperdinck said. Buttercup whispered, "I am your servant, and I refuse." "I am your prince, and you cannot refuse." "I am your loyal servant, and I just did." "Refusal means death." "Kill me then." "I'm your prince, and I'm not that bad. How could you rather be dead than married to me?" "Because," Buttercup said, "marriage involves love, and that is not a pastime at which I excel. I tried once, and it went badly, and I'm sworn never to love another." "Love," said Prince Humperdinck. "Who mentioned love? Not me, I can tell you. Look, there must always be a male heir to the throne of Florin. That's me. Once my father dies, there won't be an heir, just a king. That's me again. When that happens, I'll marry and have children until there is a son. So you can either marry me and be the richest and most powerful woman in 1,000 miles and give turkeys away at Christmas and provide me a son, or you can die in terrible pain in the very near future. Make up your own mind." "I'll never love you." "I wouldn't want it if I had it." "Then by all means, let us marry." Chapter 4 can be summarized in the following words. What with one thing and another, 3 years passed. Chapter 5. The Announcement. The great square of Florence City was filled as never before, awaiting the introduction of Prince Humperdinck's bride-to-be, Princess Buttercup of Hammersmith. The crowd had begun forming some 40 hours earlier, but up to 24 hours before, there were still fewer than 1,000. But then, as the moment of introduction grew nearer, from across the country the people came. None had ever seen the princess, but rumors of her beauty were continual, and each was less possible than the one before. At noontime, Prince Humperdinck appeared at the balcony of his father's castle and raised his arms. The crowd, which by now was at the danger size, slowly quieted. There were stories that the king was dying, that he was already dead, that he had been dead long since, that he was fine. "My people, my beloveds, from whom we draw our strength, today is a day of greeting. As you may have heard, my honored father's health is not what it once was. He is of course 97, so who can ask more? As you also know, Florin needs a male heir." The crowd began to stir now. It was to be this lady they had heard so much about. "In 3 months our country celebrates its 500th anniversary. To celebrate that celebration, I shall, on that sundown, take for my wife the Princess Buttercup of Hammersmith. You do not know her yet, but you will meet her now." And he made a sweeping gesture, and the balcony doors swung open, and Buttercup moved out beside him in the balcony. And the crowd, quite literally, gasped. The 21-year-old princess far surpassed the 18-year-old mourner. Her figure folds were gone, the too bony elbow having fleshed out nicely. The opposite pudgy wrist could not have been trimmer. Her hair, which was once the color of autumn, was still the color of autumn, except that before she attended it herself, whereas now she had 5 full-time hairdressers who managed things for her. This was long after hairdressers. In truth, ever since there have been women, there have been hairdressers, Adam being the first, though the King James scholars do their very best to muddy this point. Her skin was still wintry cream, but now, with 2 handmaidens assigned to each appendage and 4 for the rest of her, it actually, in certain lights, seemed to provide her with a gentle, continually moving as she moved, glow. Prince Humperdinck took her hand and held it high, and the crowd cheered. "That's enough. Mustn't risk overexposure," the prince said, and he started back in towards the castle. "They have waited, some of them so long," Buttercup answered. "I would like to walk among them." "We do not walk among commoners unless it is unavoidable," the prince said. "I have known more than a few commoners in my time," Buttercup told him. "They will not, I think, harm me." And with that she left the balcony, reappeared a moment later on the great steps of the castle, and quite alone walked open-armed down into the crowd. Wherever she went, the people parted. She crossed and recrossed the great square, and always, ahead of her, the people swept apart to let her pass. Buttercup continued, moving slowly and smiling, alone like some land Messiah. Most of the people there would never forget that day. None of them, of course, had ever been so close to perfection, and the great majority adored her instantly. There were, to be sure, some who, while admitting she was pleasing enough, were withholding judgment as to her quality as a queen. And of course there were some more who were frankly jealous. Very few of them hated her, and only 3 of them were planning to murder her. Buttercup naturally knew none of this. She was smiling, and when people wanted to touch her gown, well, let them. And when they wanted to brush their skin against hers, well, let them do that too. She had studied hard to do things royally, and she wanted very much to succeed. So she kept her posture erect and her smile gentle, and that her death was so close would have only made her laugh if someone had told her, but in the farthest corner of the great square, in the highest building in the land, deep in the deepest shadow, the man in black stood waiting. His boots were black and leather, his pants were black and his shirt. His mask was black, blacker than raven, but blackest of all were his flashing eyes, flashing and cruel and deadly. Buttercup was more than a little weary after her triumph. The touching of the crowds had exhausted her, so she rested a bit, and then towards mid-afternoon she changed into her riding clothes and went to fetch horse. This was the one aspect of her life that had not changed in the years preceding. She still loved to ride, and every afternoon, weather permitting or not, she rode alone for several hours in the wild land beyond the castle. She did her best thinking then. Not that her best thinking ever expanded horizons, still, she told herself she was not a dummy either, so as long as she kept her thoughts to herself, well, where was the harm? As she rode through the woods and streams and heather, her brain was a whirl. The walk through the crowds had moved her, and in a way most strange. For even though she had done nothing for 3 years now but trained to be a princess and a queen, today was the first day she actually understood that it was all soon to be a reality. "And I just don't like Humperdinck," she thought. "It's not that I hate him or anything. I just never see him. He's always off someplace or playing the zoo of death." To Buttercup's way of thinking, there were 2 main problems. 1, was it wrong to marry without like? And 2, if it was it too late to do anything about it? The answers to her way of thinking as she rode along were number 1, no, and number 2, yes. It wasn't wrong to marry someone you didn't like, it just wasn't right either. If the whole world did it, that wouldn't be so great, what with everybody kind of grunting at everybody else as the years went by. But of course not everybody did it, so forget about that. The answer to 2 was even easier. She had given her word she would marry. That would have to be enough. True, he had told her quite honestly that if she said no, he would have to have her disposed of in order to keep respect for the crown at its proper level. Still, she could have, had she so chosen, said no. Everyone had told her since she became a princess in training that she was very likely the most beautiful woman in the world. Now she was going to be the richest and most powerful as well. Don't expect too much from life, Buttercup told herself as she rode along. Learn to be satisfied with what you have. Dusk was closing in when Buttercup crested the hill. She was perhaps half an hour from the castle, and the daily ride was 3/4 done. Suddenly she reined horse, for standing in the dimness beyond was the strangest trio she had ever seen. The man in front was dark, Sicilian perhaps, with the gentlest face, almost angelic, He had one leg too short and the makings of a humpback, but he moved forward towards her with surprising speed and nimbleness. The other two remained rooted. The second, also dark, probably Spanish, was as erect and slender as the blade of steel that was attached to his side. The third man, mustachioed. Perhaps the Turk was easily the biggest human being she had ever seen. "A word?" the Sicilian said, raising his arms. His smile was more angelic than his face. Buttercup halted. "Speak." "We are but poor circus performers," the Sicilian explained. "It is dark and we are lost. We were told there was a village nearby that might enjoy our skills." "You were misinformed," Buttercup told him. "There is not one, not for many miles." "Then there will be no one to hear you scream," the Sicilian said, and he jumped with frightening agility towards her face. That was all that Buttercup remembered. Perhaps she did scream, but if she did, it was more from terror than anything else, because certainly there was no pain. His hands expertly touched places on her neck, and unconsciousness came. She awoke to the sound of lapping water. She was wrapped in a blanket, and the giant Turk was putting her in the bottom of a boat. For a moment she was about to talk, but then, when they began talking, she thought it better to listen. And after she had listened for a moment, it got harder and harder to hear, because of the terrible pounding of her heart. "I think you should kill her now," the Turk said. "The less you think, the happier I'll be," the Sicilian answered. There was the sound of ripping cloth. "What is that?" the Spaniard asked. "The same as I attached to a saddle," the Sicilian replied. "Fabric from the uniform of an officer of Gilda." "I still think," the Turk began. "She must be found dead on the Gilda frontier, or we will not be paid the remainder of our fee. Is that clear enough for you?" "I just feel better when I know what's going on, that's all," the Turk mumbled. "People are always thinking I'm so stupid because I'm big and strong and sometimes drool a little when I get excited." "The reason people think you're so stupid," the Sicilian said, "is because you are so stupid. It has nothing to do with your drooling." There came the sound of a flapping of sail. "Watch your heads," the Spaniard cautioned, and then the boat was moving. "The people of Florin will not take her death well, I shouldn't think. She has become beloved." "There will be war," the Sicilian agreed. "We have been paid to start it. It's a fine line of work to be expert in. If we do this perfectly, there will be continual demand for our services." "Well, I don't like it all that much," the Spaniard said. "Frankly, I wish you had refused." "The offer was too high." "I don't like killing a girl," the Spaniard said. "God does it all the time. If it doesn't bother him, don't let it worry you." Through all this, Buttercup had not moved. The Spaniard said, "Let's just tell her we're taking her away for a ransom." The Turk agreed. "She's so beautiful, and she'd go all crazy if she knew." "She knows already," the Sicilian said. "She's been awake for every word of this." Buttercup lay under the blanket, not moving. How could he have known that? She wondered. "How can you be sure?" the Spaniard asked. "The Sicilian senses all," the Sicilian said. Conceited, Buttercup thought. "Yes, very conceited," the Sicilian said. "He must be a mind reader," Buttercup thought. "Are you giving it full sail?" the Sicilian said. "As much as is safe," the Spaniard answered from the tiller. "We have an hour on them, so no risk yet. It will take her horse perhaps 27 minutes to reach the castle, a few minutes more for them to figure out what happened, and since we left an obvious trail, they should be after us within an hour. We should reach the cliffs in 15 minutes more, and with any luck at all, the Gilda frontier dawn when she dies. Her body should be quite warm when the prince reaches a mutilated form. I only wish we could stay for his grief. It should be Homeric." "Why does he let me know his plans?" Buttercup wondered. "You're going back to sleep now, my lady," the Spaniard said, and his fingers suddenly were touching her temple, her shoulder, her neck, and she was unconscious again. Buttercup did not know how long she was out, but they were still in the boat when she blinked, the blanket shielding her. And this time, without daring to think, the Sicilian would have known it somehow. She threw the blanket aside and dove deep into Florin Channel. She stayed under for as long as she dared and then surfaced, starting to swim across the moonless water with every ounce of strength remaining to her. Behind her in the darkness there were cries. "Go in! Go in!" from the Sicilian. "Only dog paddle!" from the Turk. "You're better than I am!" from the Spaniard. Buttercup continued to leave them behind her. Her arms ached from the effort, but she gave them no rest. Her legs kicked and her heart pounded. "I can hear her kicking," the Sicilian said. "Veer left." Buttercup went into her breaststroke, silently swimming away. "Where is she?" shrieked the Sicilian. "The sharks will get her. Don't worry," cautioned the Spaniard. "Oh dear, I wish I hadn't mentioned that," thought Buttercup. "Princess," the Sicilian called, "do you know what happens to sharks when they smell blood in the water? They go mad. There is no controlling their wildness. They rip and shred and chew and devour. And I'm in a boat, Princess, and there isn't any blood in the water now, so we're both quite safe. But there is a knife in my hand, my lady. If you don't come back, I'll cut my arms and I'll cut my legs and I'll catch the blood in a cup and I'll fling it as far as I can. And sharks can smell blood in the water for miles, and you won't be beautiful for long." Buttercup hesitated, silently treading water. Around her now, although it was surely her imagination, she seemed to be hearing the swish of giant tails. "Come back, and come back now. There'll be no other warning." Buttercup thought, "If I come back, they'll kill me anyway, so what's the difference?" "The difference is—" "There he goes doing that again," thought Buttercup. "He really is a mind reader." "If you come back now," the Sicilian went on, "I give you my word as a gentleman and assassin that you will die totally without pain. I assure you, you will get no such promise from the sharks." The fish sounds in the night were closer now. Buttercup began to tremble with fear. She was terribly ashamed of herself, but there it was. She only wished she could see for a minute if they really were sharks, and if he really would cut himself. The Sicilian winced out loud. "He just cut his arm, lady," the Turk called out. "He's catching the blood in a cup now. There must be a half-inch of blood on the bottom." The Sicilian winced again. "He cut his leg this time," the Turk went on. "The cup's getting full." "I don't believe them," Buttercup thought. "There are no sharks in the water, and there is no blood in his cup." "My arm is back to throw," the Sicilian said. "Call out your location or not, the choice is yours." "I'm not making a peep," Buttercup decided. "Farewell," from the Sicilian. There was the splashing sound of liquid landing on liquid. Then there came a pause. Then the sharks went mad. All around her, Buttercup could hear them beeping and screaming and thrashing their mighty tails. "Nothing can save me," Buttercup realized. "I'm a dead cookie." Fortunately for all concerned, save the sharks, it was around this time that the moon came out. "There she is!" shouted the Sicilian, and like lightning the Spaniard turned the boat, and as the boat drew close the Turk reached out a giant arm, and then she was back in the safety of her murderers, while all around them the sharks bumped each other in wild frustration. "Keep her warm," the Spaniard said from the tiller, tossing his cloak to the Turk. "Don't catch cold," the Turk said, wrapping Buttercup into the cloak's fold. "It doesn't seem to matter all that much," she answered, seeing you're killing me at dawn." "He'll do the actual work," the Turk said, indicating the Sicilian who was wrapping cloth around his cuts. "We'll just hold you." "Hold your stupid tongue," the Sicilian commanded. The Turk immediately hushed. "I don't think he's so stupid," Buttercup said, "and I don't think you're so smart either, with all your throwing blood in the water. That's not what I would call grade A thinking." "It worked, didn't it? You're back, aren't you?" The Sicilian crossed towards her. "Once women are sufficiently frightened, they scream." "But I didn't scream. The moon came out," answered Buttercup somewhat triumphantly. The Sicilian struck her. "Enough of that," the Turk said then. The tiny humpback looked dead at the giant. "Do you want to fight me? I don't think you do." "No, sir," the Turk mumbled. "No, but don't use force, please. Force is mine. Strike me if you feel the need. I won't care." The Sicilian returned to the other side of the boat. She would have screamed, he said. She was about to cry out. My plan was ideal, as all my plans are ideal. It was the moon's ill timing that robbed me of perfection. He scowled unforgivingly at the yellow wedge above them. Then he stared ahead. There, the Sicilian pointed, the cliffs of insanity. And there they were, rising straight and sheer from the water, 1,000 feet into the night. They provided the most direct route between Florian and Gilda, but no one ever used them, sailing instead the long way, many miles around. Not that the cliffs were impossible to scale. 2 men were known to have climbed them in the last century alone. Sail straight for the steepest part, the Sicilian commanded. The Spaniard said. I was. Buttercup did not understand. Going up the cliffs could hardly be done, she thought, and no one had ever mentioned secret passages through them. Yet here they were, sailing closer and closer to the mighty rocks, now surely less than a quarter mile away. For the first time the Sicilian allowed himself a smile. All is well. I was afraid your little John in the water was going to cost me too much time. I'd allowed an hour of safety. There must still be 50 minutes of it left. We're miles ahead of anybody, and safe, safe, safe. No one could be following us yet, the Spaniard asked. No one, the Sicilian assured him. It would be inconceivable. Absolutely inconceivable. Absolutely, totally, and in all other ways inconceivable. The Sicilian reassured him. Why do you ask? No reason, the Spaniard replied. It's only that I just happened to look back and something's there. The old world. Something was indeed there. Less than a mile behind them, across the moonlight, was another sailing boat, small, painted what looked like black, with a giant sail that billowed black in the night, and a single man at the tiller. A man in black. The Spaniard looked at the Sicilian. It must just be some local fisherman out for a pleasure cruise alone at night through shark-infested waters. There is probably a more logical explanation, the Sicilian said, but since no one in Gilda could know yet what we've done, and no one in Florian could have gotten here so quickly, he is definitely not, however much it may look like it, following us. It is a coincidence and nothing more. He's gaining on us, the Turk said. That is also inconceivable, the Sicilian said. Before I saw this boat we're in, I made many inquiries as to what was the fastest ship on all of Florian Channel, and everyone agreed it was this one. You're right, the Turk agreed, staring back. He isn't gaining on us. He's just getting closer, that's all. It is the anger we're looking from and nothing more, said the Sicilian. Buttercup could not take her eyes from the great black sail. Surely the 3 men she was with frightened her, but for some reasons, somehow she could never begin to explain. The man in black frightened her even more. All right, look sharp, the Sicilian said then, just a drop of edginess in his voice. The cliffs of insanity were very close now. The Spaniard maneuvered the craft expertly, which was not easy, and the waves were rolling in towards the rocks now, and the spray was blinding. Buttercup shielded her eyes and put her head straight back, staring up into the darkness towards the top, which seemed shrouded and out of reach. Then the humpback bounded forward, and as the ship reached the cliff face, he jumped up, and suddenly there was a rope in his hand. Buttercup stared in silent astonishment. The rope, thick and strong, seemed to travel all the way up the cliffs. As she watched, the Sicilian pulled at the rope again, and it held firm. It was attached to something at the top, a giant rock, a towering tree, something. Fast now, the Sicilian ordered. If he is following us, which of course is not within the realm of human experience, but if he is, we've got to reach the top and cut the rope off before he can climb up after us. Climb? Buttercup said. I would never be able to. Hush! The Sicilian ordered her. Get ready, he ordered the Spaniard. Sink it, he ordered the Turk. And then everyone got busy. The Spaniard took a rope, tied Buttercup's hands and feet. The Turk raised a great leg and stomped down at the center of the boat, which gave way immediately and began to sink. Then the Turk went to the rope and took it in his hands. Load me, the Turk said. The Spaniard lifted Buttercup and draped her body around the Turk's shoulders. Then he tied himself to the Turk's waist. Then the Sicilian hopped, clung to the Turk's neck. All aboard, the Sicilian said. With that, the Turk began to climb. He was at least 1,000 feet, and he was carrying the tree. But he was not worried. When it came to power, nothing worried him. When it came to reading, he got knots in the middle of his stomach, and when it came to writing, he broke out in cold sweat. And when addition was mentioned, a word's long division, he always changed the subject right away. But strength had never been his enemy. He could take the kick of a horse in his chest and not fall backward. He could take 100-pound flour sack between his legs and scissor it open without thinking. He had once held an elephant aloft, using only the muscles in his back. But his real might lay in his arms. There had never, not in 1,000 years, been arms to match physique's, for that was his name. The arms were not only gargantuan and totally obedient and surprisingly quick, but they were also, and this is why he never worried, tireless. If you gave him an axe and told him to chop down a forest, his legs might give out from having to support so much weight for so long, or the axe might shatter for the punishment of killing so many trees, but Physique's arms would be as fresh tomorrow as today. And so, even with the Sicilian on his neck and the princess around his shoulders and the Spaniard at his waist, Physique did not feel in the least bit put upon. He was actually quite happy, because it was only when he was requested to use his might that he felt he wasn't a bother to everybody. Up he climbed, arm over arm, 200 feet now above the water, 800 feet now to go. More than any of them, the Sicilian was afraid of heights. All of his nightmares, and they were never far from him when he slept, dealt with falling. So this terrifying ascension was most difficult for him, perched as he was on the neck of a giant, or should have been most difficult. But he would not allow it. From the beginning, when as a child he realized his hump body would never conquer worlds, he relied on his mind. He trained it, fought it, brought it to heel. So now 300 feet in the night and rising higher, where he should have been trembling, he was not. Instead, he was thinking of the man in black. There was no way anyone could have been quick enough to follow them, and yet from some devil's world that billowing black sail had appeared. How? How? The Sicilian flogged his mind to find an answer, but he found only failure. In wild frustration, he took a deep breath, and in spite of his terrible fears, he looked back down towards the dark water. The man in black was still there, sailing like lightning towards the cliffs. He could not have been more than a quarter of a mile from them now. "Faster!" the Sicilian commanded. "I'm sorry," the Turk answered meekly. "I thought it was going faster." "Lazy, lazy," spurred the Sicilian. "I'd never improve," the Turk answered, but his arms began to move faster than before. "I cannot see too well because your feet are locked around my face," he went on. "So could you tell me, please, if we are halfway yet?" "A little over, I should think," said the Spaniard from his position around the giant's waist. "You're doing wonderfully, Physique." "Thank you," said the giant. "And he's closing on the cliffs," added the Spaniard. No one had to ask who he was. 600 feet now. The arms continued to pull, over and over. 620 feet, 650, now faster than ever, 700. "He's left his boat behind," the Spaniard said. "He's jumped onto our rope. He's starting up after us." "I can feel him," Physique said. "His body weight on the rope. He'll never catch up," the Sicilian cried. "Inconceivable." "You keep using that word," the Spaniard snapped. "I don't think it means what you think it does." "How fast is he at climbing?" Physique said. "I'm frightened," was the Spaniard's reply. The Sicilian gathered his courage again and looked down. The man in black seemed almost to be flying. Already he had cut the lead 100 feet, perhaps more. "I thought he was supposed to be so strong," the Sicilian shouted. "I thought you were this great mighty thing, and yet he gains." "I'm carrying 3 people," Physique explained. "He has only himself, and—" "Excuses are the refuge of cowards," the Sicilian interrupted. He looked down again. The man in black had gained another 100 feet. He looked up now. The cliff tops were beginning to come into view. Perhaps 150 feet more, and they were safe. Tied hand and foot, sick with fear, Buttercup wasn't sure what she wanted to happen. Except this much she knew. She didn't want to go through anything like it again. "Fly, Physique!" the Sicilian screamed. 100 feet to go. Physique flew. He cleared his mind of everything but ropes and arms and fingers, and his arms pulled and his fingers gripped, and the rope held taut, and "He's over halfway," the Spaniard said. "Halfway to doom is where he is," the Sicilian said. "We are 50 feet from safety, and once we're there and I untie the rope," he allowed himself to laugh. 40 feet. Physique pulled. 20. 10. It was over. Physique had done it. They had reached the top of the cliffs, and first the Sicilian jumped off, and then the Turk removed the princess, and as the Spaniard untied himself, he looked back over the cliffs. The man in black was no more than 300 feet away. "It seems a shame," the Turk said, looking down alongside the Spaniard. "Such a climber deserves better than—" He stopped talking then. The Sicilian had untied the rope from its knots around an oak. The rope seemed almost alive, the greatest of all water serpents heading at last for home. It whipped across the cliff tops, spiraled into the moonlit channel. The Sicilian was roaring now, and he kept at it until the Spaniard said, "He did it." "Did what?" The humpback came scurrying to the cliff edge. "Released the rope in time," the Spaniard said. "See?" He pointed down. The man in black was hanging in space, clinging to the sheer rock face, 700 feet above the water. The Sicilian watched, fascinated. "You know," he said, "since I've made a study of death and dying, and I'm a great expert, it might interest you to know that he'll be dead long before he hits the water. The fall will do it, not the crash." The man in black dangled helpless in space, clinging to the cliffs with both hands. "Oh, how rude we are being," the Sicilian said then, turning to Buttercup. "I'm sure you'd like to watch." He went to her and brought her, still tied hand and foot, so that she could watch the final pathetic struggle of the man in black, 300 feet below. Buttercup closed her eyes, turned away. "Shouldn't we be going?" the Spaniard asked. "I thought you were telling us how important time was." It is, the Sicilian nodded, "but I just can't miss a death like this. If I could stage one of these every week and sell tickets, I could get out of the assassination business entirely. Look at him. Do you think his life is passing before his eyes? That's what the book says." "He has very strong arms," Physique commented, "to hold on so long." "He can't hold on much longer," the Sicilian said. "He has to fall soon." It was at that moment that the man in black began to climb. Not quickly, of course, and not without great effort. But still there was no doubt that he was, in spite of the sheerness of the cliffs, heading in an upward direction. "Inconceivable!" the Sicilian cried. The Spaniard whirled on him. "Stop saying that word. It was inconceivable that anyone could follow us, but when we looked behind, there was the man in black. It was conceivable that anyone could sail as fast as he could sail, and yet he gained on us. Now this too is conceivable. But look, look!" And the Spaniard pointed down through the night. "See how he rises." The man in black was indeed rising. Somehow, in some almost miraculous way, his fingers were finding holes in the crevices, and he was now perhaps 15 feet closer to the top, farther from death. The Sicilian advanced to the Spaniard now, his wild eyes glittering at the insubordination. "I have the keenest mind that has ever been turned to unlawful pursuits," he began. "So when I tell you something, it is not guesswork, it is fact. And the fact is that the man in black is not following us. A more logical explanation would be that he is simply an ordinary sailor who dabbles in mountain climbing as a hobby, who happens to have the same general final destination as we do. That certainly satisfies me, and I hope it satisfies you. In any case, we cannot take the risk of his seeing us with a princess, and therefore one of you must kill him." "Shall I do it?" the Turk wondered. The Sicilian shook his head. "No, Physique," he said finally. "I need your strength to carry the girl. Pick her up now and let us hurry along." He turned to the Spaniard. "We're heading directly for the frontier of Gilder. Catch up as quickly as you can once he's dead." The Spaniard nodded. The Sicilian hobbled away. The Turk hoisted the princess, began following the humpback. Just before he lost sight of the Spaniard, he turned and hollered, "Catch up quickly." "Don't die always," the Spaniard waved. "Farewell, Physique." "Farewell, Inigo," the Turk replied, and then he was gone, and the Spaniard was alone. Inigo moved to the cliff edge and knelt with his customary quick grace. 250 feet below him now, the man in black continued his painful climb. Inigo lay flat, staring down, trying to pierce the moonlight and find the climber's secret. For a long while Inigo did not move. He was a good learner, but not a particularly fast one, so he had to study. Finally, he realized that somehow, by some mystery, the man in black was making fists and jamming them into the rocks and using them for support. Then he would reach out with his other hand until he found a high split in the rock and make another fist and jammed it in. Whenever he could find support for his feet, he would use it, but mostly it was the jammed fist that made the climbing possible. Inigo marveled. What a truly extraordinary adventurer this man in black must be. He was close enough now for Inigo to realize that the man was masked, a black hood covering all but his features. Another outlaw, perhaps. Then why should they have to fight, and for what? Inigo shook his head. It was a shame that such a fellow must die, but he had his orders, so there it was. Sometimes he did not like the Sicilian's commands, but what could he do? Without the brains of the Sicilian, he, Inigo, would never be able to command jobs of this caliber. The Sicilian was a master planner. Inigo was a creature of the moment. The Sicilian said, "Kill him," so why waste sympathy on the man in black? Some day someone would kill Inigo, and the world would not stop to mourn. He stood now, quickly jumping to his feet, his blade-thin body ready for action. Only the man in black was still many feet away. There was nothing to do but wait for him. Inigo hated waiting, so to make the time more pleasant, he pulled from the scabbard his only love, the six-fingered sword. How it danced in the moonlight! How glorious and true! Inigo brought it to his lips, and with all the fervor in his great Spanish heart kissed the metal. Inigo. In the mountains of central Spain, set high in the hills above Toledo, was the village of Arabella. It was very small, and the air was always clear. There was all you could say that was good about Arabella. Terrific air. You could see for miles. But there was no work. The dogs overran the streets, and there was never enough food. The air, clear enough, was also too hot in daylight, freezing at night. As to Inigo's personal life, he was always just a trifle hungry. He had no brothers or sisters, and his mother had died in childbirth. He was fantastically happy. Because of his father. Domingo Montoya was funny-looking and crotchety and impatient and absent-minded and never smiled. Inigo loved him, totally. Don't ask why. There really wasn't any one reason you could put your finger on. Oh, probably Domingo loved him back, but love is many things, none of them logical. Domingo Montoya made swords. If you wanted a fabulous sword, did you go to Domingo Montoya? If you wanted a great balanced piece of work, did you go to the mountains behind Toledo? You wanted a masterpiece, a sword for the ages. Was it Arabella that your footsteps led you to? Nope. You went to Madrid. Because Madrid was where lived the famous Yesti. And if you had the money and he had the time, you got your weapon. Yesti was fat and jovial and one of the richest and most honored men in the city. And he should have been. He made wonderful swords, and noblemen bragged to each other when they owned an original Yesti. But sometimes, not often mind you, maybe once a year, maybe less, a request would come in for a weapon that was more than even Yesti could make. When that happened, did Yesti say, "Alas, I'm sorry, I cannot do it"? No. What he said was, "Of course, I'd be delighted. 50% down payment, please. The rest before delivery. Come back in a year, thank you very much." The next day he would set out for the hills behind Toledo. "So, Domingo," Yesti would call out when he reached Inigo's father's hut. "So, Yesti," Domingo Montoya would return from the hut doorway. Then the two men would embrace, and Inigo would come running up, and Yesti would rumple his hair, and then Inigo would make tea while the two men talked. I need you, Yesti would always begin. Domingo would grunt. This very week I have accepted a commission to make a sword for a member of the Italian nobility. It is to be jewel encrusted at the handle, and the jewels are to spell out the name of his present mistress and— No, that single word and that alone. But it was enough. When Domingo Montoya said no, it meant nothing else but. Inigo, busy with tea, knew what would happen now. Yesti would use his charm. No. Yesti would use his wealth. No. His wit, his wonderful gift for persuasion. No. He would beg, entreat, promise, pledge. No. Insults, threats. No. Finally, genuine tears. No. More tea, Yesti? Perhaps another cup, thank you. Then big, why won't you? Inigo hurried to refill their cups so as never to miss a word. He knew they had been brought up together, had known each other 60 years, had never not loved one another deeply, and it thrilled him when he could hear them arguing. That was the strange thing. Arguing was all they ever did. Why? My fat friend asked me why. He sits there on his world-class ass and has the nerve to ask me why. Yesti, come to me sometime with a challenge. Once, just once, ride up and say, Domingo, I need a sword for an 80-year-old man to fight a duel. And I would embrace you and cry, yes, because to make a sword for an 80-year-old man to survive a duel, that would be something. Because the sword would have to be strong enough to win, yet light enough not to tire his weary arm. I would have to use my oar to perhaps find an unknown metal, strong but very light, or devise a different formula for a known one, mix some bronze with some iron and some air in a way ignored for 1,000 years. I'd kiss your smelly feet for an opportunity like that, fat Yesti. But to make a stupid sword with stupid jewels in the form of stupid initials so some stupid Italian can trail his stupid mistress, no, that I will not do. For the last time I ask you, please, for the last time I tell you I am sorry, no. I gave my word the sword would be made, Yesti said. I cannot make it. In all the world, no one can but you. And you say no, which means I have gone back on a commitment, which means I have lost my honor, which means that since honor is the only thing in the world I care about, and since I cannot live without it, I must die. And since you are my dearest friend, I may as well die now, with you, basking in the warmth of your affection. And here Yesti would pull out a knife. It was a magnificent thing, a gift from Domingo on Yesti's wedding day. Goodbye, little Inigo, Yesti would say then. God grant you your quota of smiles. It was forbidden for Inigo to interrupt. Goodbye, little Domingo, Yesti would say then. Although I die in your hut, and although it is your own stubborn fault that causes my ceasing, in other words, even though you're killing me, don't think twice about it. I love you as I always have, and God forbid your conscience should give you any trouble. He pulled open his coat, brought the knife closer. The pain is worse than I imagined, Yesti cried. How can it hurt when the point of the weapon is still an inch away from your belly? Domingo asked. I'm anticipating. Don't bother me. Let me die unpestered. He brought the point to his skin, pushed. Domingo grabbed the knife away. Someday I won't stop you, he said. Inigo, set an extra place for supper. I was all set to kill myself truly. Enough dramatics. What is on the menu for the evening? The usual gruel. Inigo, go and check and see if there's anything by chance in my carriage outside. There was always a feast waiting in the carriage, and after the food and the stories would come the departure, and always before the departure would come the request. We would be partners, Yesti would say, in Madrid. My name before yours and the sign, of course, but equal partners in all things. No. All right, your name before mine. You're the greatest sword maker. You deserve to come first. have a good trip back. Why won't you? Because, my friend Yesti, you're very famous and very rich. And so you should be, because you make wonderful weapons. But you must also make them for any fool who happens along. I'm poor, and no one knows me in all the world except you and Inigo, but I do not have to suffer fools. You are an artist, Yesti said. No, not yet, a craftsman only. But I dream to be an artist. I pray that someday, if I work with enough care, if I'm very, very lucky, I'll make a weapon that is a work of art. Call me an artist then, and I will answer. Yesti entered his carriage. Domingo approached the window, whispered, I remind you only of this. When you get this jeweled, initialed sword, claim it as your own. Tell no one of my involvement. Your secret is safe with me. Braces and waves, the carriage would leave, and that was the way of life before the six-fingered sword. Inigo remembered exactly the moment it began. He was making lunch for them. His father always, from the time he was 6, let him do the cooking. When a heavy knocking came on the hut door. Inside there, voice boomed. Be quick about it. Inigo's father opened the door. Your servant, he said. You are a sword maker, came the booming voice. Of distinction, I've heard that this is true. If only it were, Domingo replied, but I have no great skills. Mostly I do repair work. Perhaps if you had a dagger blade that was dulling, I might be able to please you, but anything more is beyond me. Inigo crept up behind his father and peeked out. The booming voice belonged to a powerful man with dark hair and broad shoulders who sat upon an elegant brown horse. A Doberman, clearly, but Inigo could not tell the country. I desire to have made for me the greatest sword since Excalibur. I hope your wishes are granted, Domingo said, and now, if you please, our lunch is almost ready and... I do not give you permission to move. You stay right exactly where you are or risk my wrath, which I must tell you in advance is considerable. My temper is murderous. Now, what were you saying about your lunch? I was saying that it will be hours before it is ready. I have nothing to do and would not dream of budging. There are rumors, the nobleman said, that deep in the hills behind Toledo lives a genius, the greatest sword maker in all the world. He visits here sometimes. That must be your mistake. But his name is Yesti, and he lives in Madrid. I will pay 500 pieces of gold for my desires, said the big-shouldered noble. That is more money than all the men in all this village will earn in all their lives, said Domingo. Truly, I would love to accept your offer, but I am not the man you seek. These rumors lead me to believe that Domingo Montoya would solve my problem. What is your problem? I'm a great swordman, but I cannot find a weapon to match my peculiarities, and therefore I am deprived of reaching my highest skills. If I had a weapon to match my peculiarities, there would be no one in all the world to equal me. What are these peculiarities you speak of? The noble held up his right hand. Domingo began to grow excited. The man had 6 fingers. You see, the noble began. Of course, Domingo interrupted. The balance of the sword is wrong for you because every balance has been conceived of for 5. The grip of every handle crams you because it has been built for 5. For an ordinary swordman, it would not matter, but a great swordman, a master, would have eventual discomfort, and the greatest swordman in the world must always be at ease. The grip of his weapon must be as natural as the blink of his eye and cause him no more thought. Clearly you understand the difficulties, the nobleman began again. But Domingo had travelled where others' words could never reach him. Inigo had never seen his father so frenzied. The measurements, of course, each finger the circumference of the wrist, and the distance from the 6th nail to the index pad. So many measurements, and your preference, do you prefer to slash or cut? If you slash, do you prefer the right to left movement, or perhaps the parallel? When you cut, do you enjoy an upward thrust? And how much power do you wish to come from the shoulder? How much from the wrist? And do you wish your point coated so as to enter more easily, or do you enjoy seeing the opponent's wins? So much to be done, so much to be done. And on he went until the noble dismounted and had to almost take him by the shoulders to quiet him. "You are the man of the rumors," Domingo nodded, "and you will make me the greatest sword since Excalibur. I will beat my body into ruins for you. Perhaps I will fail, but no one will try harder. And payment? When you get the sword, then payment. Now let me get to work measuring. Inigo, my instruments." Inigo scurried into the darkest corner of the hut. "I insist on leaving something on account. It is not necessary. I may fail. I insist." "All right. 1 gold piece, leave that, but do not bother me with money when there is work that needs beginning." The noble took out 1 piece of gold. Domingo put it in a drawer and left it without even a glance. "Feel your fingers now," he commanded. "Rub your hands hard, shake your fingers. You'll be excited when you duel, and this handle must match your hand in that excitement. If I measured when you were relaxed, there would be a difference as much as 1,000th of an inch, and that would rob us of perfection. That is what I seek, perfection. I will not rest for less." The nobleman had to smile. "And how long will it take to reach it?" "Come back in a year," Domingo said. With that, he set to work. Such a year. Domingo slept only when he dropped from exhaustion. He ate only when Inigo would force him to. He studied, fretted, and complained. He never should have taken the job. It was impossible. The next day he would be flying. He never should have taken the job. It was too simple to be worth his labors. Joy to despair, day to day, hour to hour. Sometimes Inigo would wake to find him weeping. "What is it, father?" "'Tis that I cannot do it. I cannot make the sword. I cannot make my hands obey me. I would kill myself, except what would you do then?" "Go to sleep, father." "No, I don't need sleep. Failures don't need sleep. Anyway, I slept yesterday. Please, father, a little nap." "All right, a few minutes, to keep you from nagging." Some nights Inigo would awake to see him dancing. "What is it, father?" "'Tis that I have found my mistakes, corrected my misjudgments." "Then it will be done soon, father. It will be done tomorrow, and it will be a miracle." "You're wonderful, father." "I'm more wonderful than wonderful. How dare you insult me?" Then the next night more tears. "What is it now, father?" "The sword! The sword! I cannot make the sword." "But last night, father, you said you had found your mistakes." "I was mistaken. Tonight I found new ones, worse ones, and the most wretched of creatures. Say you wouldn't mind if I killed myself so I could end this existence." "But I would mind, father. I love you, and I would die if you stopped breathing." "You don't really love me. You're only speaking pity. Who could pity the greatest sword maker in the history of the world?" "Thank you, Inigo." "You're welcome, father." "I love you back, Inigo. Sleep, father." "Yes, sleep." A whole year of that. A year of the handle being right, but the balance being wrong. Of the balance being right, but the cutting edge too dull. Of the cutting edge sharpened, but that threw the balance off again. Of the balance returning, but now the point was fat. Of the point regaining sharpness, only now the entire blade was too short, and it all had to go, all had to be thrown out, all had to be done again. Again. Domingo's health began to leave him. He was fevered always now. But he forced his frail shell on, 'cause this had to be the finest since Excalibur. Domingo was battling legend, and it was destroying him. Such a year. One night Inigo woke to find his father seated, staring, calm. Inigo followed the stare. The 6-fingered sword was done. Even in the hut's darkness it glistened. "At last," Domingo whispered. He could not take his eyes from the glory of the sword. "After a lifetime, Inigo. Inigo, I'm an artist." The big-shouldered nobleman did not agree. When he returned to purchase the sword, he merely looked at it a moment. "Not worth waiting for," he said. Inigo stood in the corner of the hut, watching, holding his breath. "You're disappointed?" Domingo could scarcely get the words spoken. I'm not saying it's trash, you understand, the nobleman went on, but it's certainly not worth 500 pieces of gold. I'll give you 10. It's probably worth that. Wrong, Domingo cried. It is not worth 10. It is not worth even 1. Here. And he threw open the drawer where the 1 gold piece had lain and touched the ear. The gold is yours, all of it. You've lost nothing. He took back the sword and turned away. I'll take the sword, the nobleman said. I didn't say I wouldn't take it. I only said I would pay what it was worth. Domingo whirled back, eyes bright. You quibbled. You haggled. Art was involved and you saw only money. Beauty was here for the taking. You saw only your fat purse. You have lost nothing. There is no more reason for your remaining here. Please go. The sword, the noble said. The sword belongs to my son, Domingo said. I'll give it to him now. It is forever his. Goodbye. You're a peasant and a fool, and I won my sword. You're an enemy of art, and I pity your ignorance, Domingo said. They were the last words he ever uttered. The noble killed him then, with no warning. A flash of the nobleman's sword, and Domingo's heart was torn to pieces. Inigo screamed. He could not believe it. It had not happened. He screamed again. His father was fine. Soon they would have tea. He could not stop screaming. The village heard. 20 men were at the door. The nobleman pushed his way through them. That man attacked me. See? He holds a sword. He attacked me and I defended myself. Now move from my way. It was lies, of course, and everyone knew it. But he was a noble, so what was there to do? They parted, and the nobleman mounted his horse. Coward, the nobleman whirled. Pig! Again the crowd parted. Inigo stood there, holding the 6-fingered sword, repeating his words. Coward, pig, killer! Someone tend the babe before he oversteps himself, the noble said to the crowd. Inigo ran forward then, standing in front of the nobleman's horse, blocking the nobleman's path. He raised the 6-fingered sword with both his hands and cried, I, Inigo Montoya, do challenge you, coward, pig, killer, ass, fool, to battle. Get him out of my way. Move the infant. The infant is 10 and he stays, Inigo said. Enough of your family is dead for one day. Be content, said the noble. When you beg me for your breath, then I shall be contented. Now dismount. The nobleman dismounted. Draw your sword. The nobleman unsheathed his killing weapon. I dedicate your death to my father, Inigo said. Begin. They began. It was no match, of course. Inigo was disarmed in less than a minute. But for the first 15 seconds or so, the noble was uneasy. During those 15 seconds, strange thoughts crossed his mind. For even at the age of 10, Inigo's genius was there. Disarmed, Inigo stood very straight. He said not a word, begged nothing. I'm not going to kill you, the nobleman said, because you have talent and you're brave. But you're also lacking in manners, and that's going to get you in trouble if you're not careful. So I shall help you as you go through life by leaving you with a reminder that bad manners are to be avoided. With that his blade flashed 2 times. And Inigo's face began to bleed. 2 rivers of blood poured from his forehead to his chin, one crossing each cheek. Everyone watching knew it then. The boy was scarred for life. Inigo would not fall. The world went white behind his eyes, but he would not go to ground. The blood continued to pour. The nobleman replaced his sword, remounted, rode on. It was only then that Inigo allowed the darkness to claim him. He awoke to Yesti's face. I was beaten, Inigo whispered. I failed him. Yesti could only say, sleep. Inigo slept. The bleeding stopped after a day, and the pain stopped after a week. They buried Domingo, and for the first and last time, Inigo left Arabella. His face bandaged, he rode in Yesti's carriage to Madrid, where he lived in Yesti's house, obeyed Yesti's commands. After a month, the bandages were removed, but the scars were still deep red. Eventually they softened some, but they always remained the chief features of Inigo's face. The giant parallel scars running one on each side from temple to chin. For 2 years, Yesti cared for him. Then one morning, Inigo was gone. In his place were 3 words, "I must learn," on a note pinned to his pillow. Learn? Learn what? What existed beyond Madrid that the child had to commit to memory? Yesti shrugged and sighed. It was beyond him. There was no understanding children anymore. Everything was changing too fast, and the young were different. Beyond him, beyond him. Life was beyond him. The world was beyond him. You name it. It was beyond him. He was a fat man who made swords. That much he knew. So he made more swords, and he grew fatter, and the years went by. As his figure spread, so did his fame. From all across the world they came, begging him for weapons. So he doubled his prices because he didn't want to work too hard anymore. He was getting old. But when he doubled his prices, when the news spread from duke to prince to king, they only wanted him the more desperately. Now the wait was 2 years for a sword, and the lineup of royalty was unending, and Yesti was growing tired, so he doubled his prices again. And when that didn't stop them, he decided to triple his already doubled and redoubled prices, and besides that, all work had to be paid for in jewels in advance. And the wait was up to 3 years, but nothing would stop them. They had to have swords by Yesti or nothing, and even though the work on the finest was nowhere what it once was, Domingo, after all, no longer could save him. The silly, rich man didn't notice. All they wanted was his weapons, and they fell over each other with jewels for him. Yesti grew very rich and very heavy. Every part of his body sagged. He had the only fat thumbs in Madrid. Dressing took an hour. Breakfast the same. Everything went slowly. But he could still make swords, and people still craved them. "I'm sorry," he said to the young Spaniard who entered his shop one particular morning. "The wait is up to 4 years, and even I'm embarrassed to mention the price. Have your weapon made by another." "I have my weapon," the Spaniard said, and he threw the 6-fingered sword across Yesti's workbench. Such embraces! "Never leave again," Yesti said. "I eat too much when I'm lonely." "I cannot stay," Inigo told him. "I'm only here to ask you one question. As you know, I've spent the last 10 years learning. Now I've come for you to tell me if I'm ready." "Ready? For what? What in the world have you been learning?" "The sword." "Madness," said Yesti. "You've spent 10 entire years just learning to fence?" "No, not just learning to fence," Inigo answered. "I did many other things as well. Tell me." "Well," Inigo began, 10 years is what? About 3,600 days. And that's about, I figured this out once, so I remember pretty well, about 86,000 hours. Well, I always made it a point to get 4 hours sleep per night. That's 14,000 hours right there, leaving me perhaps 72,000 hours to account for." "You slept. I'm with you. What else?" "Well, I squeezed rocks." "I'm sorry. My hearing sometimes fails me. It sounded like you said you squeezed rocks to make my wrist strong, so I could control the sword. Rocks like apples, that size. I would squeeze them in each hand for perhaps 2 hours a day, and I would spend another 2 hours a day in skipping and dodging and moving quickly, so that my feet would be able to get me into position to deliver properly the thrust of the sword. That's another 14,000 hours. I'm down to 58,000 now. Well, I always sprinted 2 hours each day as fast as I could, so my legs, as well as being quick, would also be strong, and that gets me down to about 50,000 hours." Yesti examined the young man before him. Blade thin, 6 feet in height, straight as a sapling, bright-eyed, taut. Even motionless, he seemed whippet quick. "And these last 50,000 hours, these have been spent studying the sword?" Inigo nodded. "Where?" "Wherever I could find a master. Venice, Bruges, Budapest." I could have taught you here. True, but you care for me. You would not have been ruthless. You would have said, excellent parry, Inigo. Now that's enough for one day. Let's have supper. That does sound like me, Yesti admitted. But why was it so important? Why was it worth so much of your life? Because I could not fail him again. Fail who? My father. I spent all these years preparing to find the six-fingered man and kill him in a duel. But he's a master, Yesti. He said as much, and I saw the way his sword flew at Domingo. I must not lose that duel when I find him. So now I have come to you. You know swords and swordsmen. You must not lie. Am I ready? If you say I am, I will seek him through the world. If you say no, I will spend another 10 years and another 10 after that, if that is needed. So they went to Yesti's courtyard. It was late morning, hot. Yesti put his body in a chair and the chair in the shade. Inigo stood waiting in the sunshine. We need to test desire, and we know you have sufficient motive to deliver the death blow, Yesti said. Therefore, we need only probe your knowledge and speed and stamina. We need no enemy for this. The enemy is always in the mind. Visualize him. Inigo drew his sword. The six-fingered man taunts you, Yesti called. Do what you can. Inigo began to leap around the courtyard, the great blade flashing. He uses the Agrippa defense. Yesti shouted. Immediately Inigo shifted position, increased the speed of his sword. Now he surprises you with Bonetti's attack. But Inigo was not surprised for long. Again his feet shifted. He moved his body a different way. Perspiration was pouring down his thin frame now, and the great blade was blinding. Yesti continued to shout. Inigo continued to shift. The blade never stopped. At 3 in the afternoon, Yesti said, Enough! I'm exhausted from watching. Inigo sheathed the six-fingered sword and waited. You wish to know if I feel you are ready to duel to the death, a man ruthless enough to kill your father, rich enough to buy protection, older and more experienced, an acknowledged master. Inigo nodded. I'll tell you the truth, and it's up to you to live with it. First, there has never been a master as young as you. 30 years at least before that rank has yet been reached, and you're barely 22. Well, the truth is you're an impetuous boy driven by madness, and you're not now, and you will never be a master. Thank you for your honesty, Inigo said. I must tell you I'd hoped for better news. Found it very hard to speak just now. So if you will please excuse me, I'll be on my... I had not finished, Yesti said. What else is there to say? I loved your father very dearly, that you know, but this you did not know. When we were very young, not yet 20, we saw with our own eyes an exhibition by the Corsican wizard, Bastia. I know of no wizard. It is the rank beyond master in swordsmanship, Yesti said. Bastia was the last man so designated. Long before your birth, he died at sea. There have been no wizards since. You would never in this world have beaten him. But I tell you this, he would never in this world have beaten you. Inigo stood silent for a long time. I'm ready then. I would not enjoy being the six-fingered man, was all Yesti replied. The next morning Inigo began to track down. He had it all carefully prepared in his mind. He would find the six-fingered man. He would go up to him. He would say simply, Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die. And then, oh then, the duel. It was a lovely plan really. Simple, direct, no frills. In the beginning, Inigo had all kinds of wild vengeance notions, but gradually, simplicity had seemed the better way. Originally, he had all kinds of little plays worked out in his mind. The enemy would weep and beg. The enemy would cringe and cry. The enemy would bribe and slobber and act in every way unmanly. But eventually, these two gave way in his mind to simplicity. The enemy would simply say, Oh yes, I remember killing him. I'll be only too delighted to kill you too. Inigo had only one problem. He could not find the enemy. It never occurred to him there would be the least difficulty. After all, how many noblemen were there with 6 fingers in their right hands? Surely it would be the talk of whatever his vicinity happened to be. A few questions. Pardon, I'm not crazy, but have you seen any six-fingered noblemen lately? And surely, sooner or later, there would be an answering yes. But it didn't come sooner. And later wasn't the kind of thing you wanted to hold your breath for either. The first month wasn't all that discouraging. Inigo crisscrossed Spain and Portugal. The second month he moved to France and spent the rest of the year there. The year following that was his Italian year, and then came Germany and the whole of Switzerland. It was only after 5 solid years of failure that he began to worry. By then he had seen all of the Balkans and most of Scandinavia, and had visited the Florinese and the natives of Gilda, and into Mother Russia, and down step by step around the entire Mediterranean. By then he knew what had happened. 10 years learning was 10 years too long. Too much had been allowed to happen. The six-fingered man was probably crusading in Asia, or getting rich in America, or a hermit in the East Indies, or dead? Inigo, at the age of 27, began having a few extra glasses of wine at night to help him get to sleep. At 28, he was having a few extra glasses to help him digest his lunch. At 29, the wine was essential to wake him in the morning. His world was collapsing around him. Not only was he living in daily failure, something almost as dreadful was beginning to happen. Fencing was beginning to bore him. He was simply too good. He would make his living during his travels by finding the local champion wherever he happened to be, and they would duel, and Inigo would disarm him and accept whatever they happened to bet, and with his winnings he would pay for his food, and his lodging, and his wine. But the local champions were nothing. Even in the big cities, the local experts were nothing. Even in the capital cities, the local masters were nothing. There was no competition, nothing to help him keep an edge. His life began to seem pointless. His quest, pointless, everything without reason. At 30, he gave up the ghost. He stopped his search, forgot to eat, slept only on occasion, yet his wine for company, and that was enough. He was a shell. The greatest fencing machine since the Corsican wizard was barely even practicing the sword. He was in that condition when the Sicilian found him. At first the little hunchback only supplied him with stronger wine, but then through a combination of praise and nudging, the Sicilian began to get him off the bottle. Because the Sicilian had a dream. With his guile, plus the Turk's strength, plus the Spaniard's sword, they might become the most effective criminal organization in the civilized world. Which is precisely what they became. In dark places, their names whipped sharper than fear. Everyone had needs that were hard to fulfill. The Sicilian crowd, 2 was company, 3 a crowd, even then, became more and more famous and more rich. Nothing was beyond or beneath them. Inigo's blade was flashing again, more than ever like lightning. The Turk's strength grew more prodigious with the months. But the hunchback was the leader. There was never doubt. Without him, Inigo knew where he would be, on his back, begging wine in some alley entrance. The Sicilian's word was not just law, it was gospel. So when he said, "Kill the man in black," all other possibilities ceased to exist. The man in black had to die.